Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Garrison, for that very fine introduction, and particularly for that nice plug for my Who's Your Husband. I think that's one time I displayed rare good judgment. Dr. Evans, distinguished members of the steering committee, distinguished teachers of Eastern Indiana, I truly am delighted to be here today because I do feel as if I'm sort of coming into a second home, having married a man who was born in Francisville, Indiana, who grew up in Lafayette, whose father was passenger agent for the Monon Railroad for many years, so that the name of John Preist and Monon became almost synonymous. And of course, we still have some farms at Francisville, so I feel that I have a second home here in Indiana. And I might say that I welcome every opportunity to come into the state, and as you perhaps are well aware of that fact, since I've made quite a few speeches in the state of Indiana. But I did say one thing. I thought that you Hoosiers should do a little more bragging. I was a little disappointed that you didn't brag enough about this great state. I think I told them at French Lick that if they didn't do a little more bragging, I was going to be inclined to bring in a few Texans to teach them how. And of course, by that, I just gave a little illustration of what I meant when the bankers all met in Chicago last September, and a Texas banker was going down Michigan Boulevard and happened to see a man's haberdashery shop, and in the window was a beautiful red tie. Oh, he thought that was the most beautiful red tie he'd ever seen, so he went in and he said, "Ma'am, that's the prettiest red tie I've ever seen in my life. How much is it, please, ma'am?" She said, "That's $20, sir." $20 for a necktie? Never paid over more than $1.50 for a necktie in my life. That's just too much money for a necktie. And she looked at him with all the air that she could muster of great haughtiness and said, "Sir, in here we begin at $20. "Oh, excuse me, ma'am," he said, "I guess I've made a mistake." But he went out and he couldn't get that red tie off his mind. So he came back and he said, "Ma'am, that's the prettiest red necktie I've ever seen in my life. I just have to have it. You better just wrap it up." So she did, and he pulled out a great roll of bills to pay for the red necktie, pulled a $500 bill off the top, and she said, "Oh, sir, don't you have anything smaller than that?" "Ma'am, where I come from, we begin at $500. See what I mean? And then there was the Texas oil man who came back to Washington to see what we were doing with the tax money. He said, "I'm paying a lot of money back here in income taxes, and I just thought I'd come back and see what you're doing with it." He says, "Matter of fact, I'm just keeping my 27.5 cents depletion allowance, and I'm sending you the rest, and it's a lot of money, and I just thought I'd see what you're doing with it." Well, we went into great length to explain all the services that government renders its people, and we stressed defense and security, and we went from weather stations in Iceland to the Coast Guard and all the numerous things that government must provide. And when we got through, he says, "That's sure a heap of services, ain't it?" Well, yes, we thought it was, and then he began to chuckle. "Well, now, what's funny about that?" we said. "Why are you laughing about that?" He said, "I'm not laughing." He said, "Nothing funny about it, nothing funny about it at all." He said, "But I was just thinking it's sure lucky we don't get all the government we pay for." So you see what I mean. We have to do a little bragging about the great state of Indiana. And today, as I was fortunate enough to sit up here on the platform and hear this beautiful chorus, to sing those songs, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and to suddenly realize that in selecting the particular songs they sang today, that Mr. Milton probably had it in mind, I don't know, but he sort of summed up a little bit about this meeting. Definitely, that chorus of young people was lovely to look at and delightful to know. And very definitely, from the standpoint of a speaker, this large audience, this hall filled with you teachers, to a speaker, believe me, you're lovely to look at and delightful to know. And then he said something, the other song was, "He has the world in the palm of his hand." And I thought, how true that is for you teachers. Teachers of the world who are molding the citizens of tomorrow. You indeed do have the world in the palm of your hand. I am not sure whether Mr. Milton just picked those selections specially but I thought they were most appropriate. And then, of course, I have to get down to my subject, which is most dry, most uninteresting. I'll tell you what, ladies and gentlemen, if I were to take the first hour, I'm a brief speaker of a couple of hours. The only thing that will save you today is I have to make a plane. But I could take that first time with sort of just telling you a little about the interesting things that happen in the life of the lady in charge of the money. Money is a most interesting subject, not the monetary policies particularly, but money in and of itself. Or some of the embarrassing things. They were embarrassing at the time they happened. They're a little funny as I look back on them. Or I could even tell you a little about my mail. But you know, I do have one prize letter in that category of mail, which I often tell about. I think it was one of the outstanding letters that I received shortly after I became treasurer, and I tell about it quite often, so if you've heard me tell about this letter before, please bear with me. It came from a man in California who said, "My dear lady treasurer," had the lady all underlined. He said, "I'm getting sick and tired of reading about this huge national debt and about the government's inability to balance the budget and about all this deficit spending, when the solution to the whole thing is so simple." He said, "You waste all that paper printing the money on both sides. Why don't you just print the money on one side and sell the other side for advertising? You got it licked." Suppose the day would ever come when we could have Ball State Teachers College on the back of a $1 billion bill or something. And by the way, about those samples, you know, I'm just as disappointed as I can be, but you did have to have this meeting on Saturday. We can't give them away on Saturdays. Then, of course, there was the letter from the lady, and this I say, ladies, for us. There was the letter from the lady in North Carolina who wrote in to say that she was delighted that again a lady had been appointed Treasurer of the United States, and she hoped that by now we had established a precedent so that this would be the order of the day. She said, "But now, my dear lady, I want you to do something about seeing to it that we get women's pictures on that money." She says, "I don't think it's fair that all of the money has to have all of the men's pictures, great as they were." So in order to answer the letter, I went back through the earliest issue of Currency, and I found that we not only had women's pictures, we had group pictures of women and children. We had the allegorical figures of faith, hope, and charity. We had the Greek figures of goddess of earth and so on, a goddess of plenty or whatever it was. And I wrote this in a letter to her, explained how we had very beautiful currency. And then I said, in parentheses, not too many years ago, we had a dollar bill, but on the back of the dollar bill, on one side of the one, we had the picture of Martha Washington. On the other side of the one, we had the picture of George Washington. Most people thought that, insisted that this be discontinued because they felt that no one should come between a man and his wife. But I pointed out to the lady that we women should not lose sight of the important things. I don't believe we minded the men having their faces on the money as long as we get our hands on it. Now, I think that's important. And so we could go on and on this monetary thing, but I have one more little embarrassing incident, which I will tell you because many of you have read about it anyway, and I might as well tell you the full story. I was highly embarrassed, but it happened. It seems that I was a little too anxious to get back to my native state of Utah this summer, and we were going across one of our states, wide open spaces and so on, and I just neglected to pay attention to the road signs, which is a very bad thing, especially if you're on the board of directors of the National Safety Council, as I was. Well, at any rate, the officer called my attention to this little fact and said, "I'll have to take you to see the judge." The judge was holding court in the firehouse in this little town, and it was 10 o'clock of a Sunday morning. He knew, I suppose, that he was going to get plenty of cases that day, so he was there. And he asked for my driver's license, and I meekly put it up, hoping that the name Ivy Baker Priest would not mean a thing because I was so highly embarrassed. But it did. That smart judge just looked at me and he said, "Say, are you that lady that signs all our money?" And I meekly admitted that I was. He turned to the boys in the firehouse and he said, "Boys, we've sure hit the jackpot today." Well, ladies and gentlemen, I wish I could continue on to tell you a lot of these things that happened, but I do have some thoughts that I want to leave with you today, and I want to stress, uninteresting as the subject might be, I do want to stress our monetary policies and the effect that it has on our domestic economy, because we all have a vital stake in the management of the monetary policies of this country. And so I'm going to have to get on into that subject. And I will start by saying that if you were to pay a visit to the Treasury in Washington today, and I hope you will, and I hope many of you have, besides seeing that we've had that building all cleaned up, and it's truly one of the most beautiful buildings in Washington, because this is the first time it's been cleaned in something like 79 years. But it's truly a beautiful building today. But if you look at that scene in Washington today, you'll find it's quite different from the one on the back of your $10 bill. That scene on the back of the $10 bill is quite a languid scene. Handful of people going nowhere in particular, a nondescript vehicle rattling down the all but deserted street. Yes, it was quite a languid scene, but instead of that, you come upon one of purposeful activity today. Men and women hurrying in and out of the Treasury building to carry on the many tasks that must be carried on in the financial life of this country. Now, our tasks in the Treasury could be broken down into individual tasks such as issuing currency, collecting taxes, paying checks, settling claim checks, supervising government depositories, compiling the financial statement, and many, many more. But this would be like breaking down a mosaic and scrutinizing each individual piece so skillfully fitted together, yet overlooking the whole picture. Because all of these tasks are in the main just part of the greater objective, that of securing and maintaining a sound and stable dollar. Now, by a sound and stable dollar, I just do not necessarily mean one that looks good to the touch, or feels good to the touch, or looks good to the eye, because you see, a small force of Secret Service men, together with the help of all law-abiding citizens, see to it that we in the Treasury can be justly proud of the crispness of the currency, of the genuine ring of our coins, and of the integrity of our checks. But by a sound and stable dollar, I mean one in which you and I, the American citizen, can have unlimited confidence, because this is a basic tool for a prosperous and an expanding economy. An economy of free competitive enterprise wherein the initiative of the man or woman who dreams and builds is amply rewarded. Yes. Wherein the individual is free to accept the challenge to life and to feel the thrill and elation that comes from successful fulfillment. This has been the cherished ideal of this nation since its founding. It will always be the cherished ideal of our great nation. And so, coming from Treasury as I do, I want to talk, of course, briefly about money, credit, and monetary policies. And I might say here now, ladies and gentlemen, that since they print all these finer than they used to, I have to get a little help from time to time. It's an economy move, I suppose, but I've noticed print is much finer than it used to be. You know, a good deal of money passes through my hands, at almost the entire collection and expenditures of the federal government. Billions and billions of dollars. Of course, I personally see very little of this money. Most of the physical transactions of money take place at the Federal Reserve banks throughout the land. But of course, there's the 20-plus billions or more worth of Federal Reserve and United States currency that I've signed, which is out in circulation and for which I'm responsible. But money is not merely a medium of exchange. It is a motive power of the constantly changing standard of living. It rewards those who contribute to its increase. People who like to make and spend money provide the foundation for an expanding economy, so that money, credit, and monetary policies, as I've said earlier, live close to the roots of our national welfare and vitally affect the lives of each and every one of us. We have a vital stake in the management of the monetary policies in Washington. Wise management results in more jobs, safe bank deposits, safe investments, higher returns in terms of food, shelter, clothing, services, all of these for every dollar expended. Now, in a country such as ours and under our system, sound monetary policies cannot survive and be truly effective without the support of the public, and this requires understanding. And with that, I want to read a little excerpt from one of the financial magazines, which I think says this perhaps a little better than I can when I talk about it requiring understanding of our economic policies on the part of our public. And he says this, the report says this: the technical progress of this generation is so far ahead of its economic understanding that we are living in two different eras at once, several centuries apart. The greatest period of material advancement in history is just before us, if we can see to it that our knowledge of dollars and cents keep pace with our knowledge of the atom, the electron, and the machine. And if we don't, then our swift technological progress may be simply the means of going backward faster. And I can say a little more on this later, but I do want to quote Dr. Helen G. Knoyer, Dean of the New York State College of Home Economics at Cornell University. And she had this to say about this economic understanding, quote, "For the first time in human history, a world without poverty and without war is technically possible. Ideas can keep pace with techniques, but if our nation is to continue to take advantage of the great opportunities offered by our own form of free enterprise, if we are going to help a free world to survive, then ideas and understandings must spread beyond the circle of the experts and the leaders to every single individual. Our judgment," she continues, "cannot be better than our information. We are probably the most propagandized generation in all history. Our ignorance of simple economic principles is quite shocking, particularly when we realize that our decision will control not only our nation's situation, but the world's. And so," she continues, "this means that every American citizen should become better informed about the basic principles of economics. There's a great need for economic education at the grassroots level so that the people of the United States may realize the great opportunities and advantages of this free economy of ours." And with that, I wholeheartedly agree. And so, to get back into our part of it, I'd like to break down just a little more and tell you that unlike or contrary to the popular opinion that the Treasury is a repository of great wealth with billions of dollars in the vaults, the truth is that in the Treasury itself, there exists but a bare minimum of cash sufficient for handling the transactions of the Treasury in Washington. Now, I know you're thinking about all that gold at Fort Knox. We'll go right on thinking about it. I'm glad it's there. But the policy of keeping as low a balance on hand as feasible stems from the days of the first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, and have been followed more or less rigidly down through the ages. Now, the custody of United States funds, whether they're in the Treasury or in the Federal Reserve or other banks throughout the land, is the responsibility of the Treasurer of the United States. And as you know, the spending of the money or the authorization to spend is in the hands of Congress. And the source of our money, need I tell you, is taxes in one way or another. For simplicity's sake, we might say it's a comparison of a joint banking account wherein the people put the money in the form of deposits, Congress pays it out in the form of appropriations, and so on. Then we could say, in the words of a popular ditty of not too many years ago, there's the rub. Our joint account's retarded by one persistent flaw. The public has been fast on the deposits, but Congress has been quicker on the draw. Well, I often say some of these illustrations of monetary principles we sometimes make a little too simple. Probably a little like the first grader who was coaching the little brother going into kindergarten the next year about school. And he says, "You know, Jimmy," he says, "there's just one thing to remember. don't you learn to spell your first word. Because the minute you learn to spell C-A-T, from there on it gets harder and harder. But in general, our purpose in the Treasury is to help provide the proper economic setting for this nation. And Secretary Humphrey has outlined the objectives quite fully when he said, first, our first objective is to reduce the deficit, and then at the earliest possible time balance the budget by reducing federal expenditures to the very minimum within the limits of safety. Second, to manage properly the burden of debt that we have. And third, to see to it that we will have a sound and stable dollar and not one of declining value, and that we thereby encourage savings and investments and protect the insurances and the savings of our people. Fourth, that we work toward the to a continued reduction in the taxes and to a continued study of the tax structure with an eye to eliminating inequalities and simplifying it as much as possible. And fifth, and I think most important of all, that we work to preserve the great symbol of America, the opportunity for all of us to grow and to develop to the very limits of our own abilities, hard work, and endeavors. This, to me, is the important symbol. Now, federal monetary policies have played an important role in the history of our nation. Just exactly how important, I'll leave, of course, to the historians. But in times past, the monetary policies have served to hamper and hobble a nation's growth by a tangle of successive layers of regulations, of controls, of subsidies, and taxes imposed. And at times they've served to twist things into the shape of things past, when they should have been giving encouragement to American free enterprise to move on to providing for us an ever more abundant life. Now, here in the United States, we're breaking all records in the number of people with jobs and the high wages they're receiving and in the production of goods for our people to enjoy. The great majority of Americans are enjoying high prosperity at this time, and the productive capacity of our country is so great that we can, without strain, provide the means for steadily improving our standard of living. And as Dr. Emmons pointed out, we can, if we will, provide the means for a program for our schools. Now, our total national production of goods and services now approaches something close to $400 billion. This is just 20 times as much as it was at the turn of the century, even if you make allowances for the price rises during that period. And then our population has more than doubled. Our national income now is over $320 billion. And of course, this is 7 times, even after allowances for price changes during the period, this is 7 times greater than it was in 1900. And there's another important thing to remember about this income change since the turn of the century. The lower and middle income groups have received the greatest share of our increased income. Early in the century, only 1 out of every 10 American families earned as much as $4,000 a year. Now, that is in terms of today's prices. Now, almost half of our families earn more than $4,000 a year. So those with inadequate incomes for a decent living are becoming fewer and fewer. And in this magazine, again, your teachers will be interested to know, we say that our average income now exceeds $4,000 a year, and we need it because we're having 4 million babies a year. And those babies are going to have to go to school in just a few short years. Those are some things we should think about when we think of, in terms of our school systems of this country and our educational setup. Well, I mention these things by a way of providing essential background for a little understanding of our federal monetary policies of the present day. And if they're to keep in step with the times, they must be predicated on the fact that within the last half-century, this nation has gone through an economic evolution that far outdistances any other in the long history of man's effort to achieve a better life. The result is that this nation today is a nation made up of small to medium investors You and I, with our life insurances, our pensions, our savings, our what stocks we might own, and so on, our savings bond. Savings and investments, however, are types hitherto infrequent or non-existent as far as the great numbers of our people are concerned, and as a consequence, they might quite often be overlooked. Now, one of the forms of investments, insurance, or in United States savings bonds, or in pensions, retirements, or trust funds. At the turn of the century, the people in this country had taken out, for example, in one division only, about $14 million in life insurance policies. Today, with a greater population, it's true, but the number of life insurance policies have increased nearly 18 times to about 250 million. And ownership of individuals in these life insurance policies has increased from under $2 billion at the turn of the century to more than $85 billion today. Holdings in United States savings bonds, of course, were non-existent at the turn of the century. Today, the total, a huge amount of something like $50 billion. $50 billion wholly owned by small investors. So the average man today in this nation has been making himself over into an investor such as no other average citizen anywhere has ever done before. Nearly 10% of all American families today own stock in American corporations. And of course, at the turn of the century, we know this was just barely getting underway. Many American workmen today automatically become investors through the labor unions to which they pay dues. Many union treasuries, which not too many years ago were bare, now contain huge sums. They own banks and buildings and bonds and stocks and investments of many kinds. Naturally, these are investments belonging to the workmen. Today, more than 15 million Americans have more than $30 billion invested in pension and retirement trust funds. Well, you can see from these few examples what has been happening to the ordinary individual and the ordinary family in our wonderful economy. And one consequence of this brilliant achievement in our nation is that every citizen, almost without exception, as I said earlier, has become a small investor and is growing more and more to be. And that is that the vast sum of many small savings of the average wage earner on which our industrial and commercial system depends for its financing. So the sum of all the little savings, if you please, is funneled mainly into the big investments by savings banks, building and loan associations, insurance companies, investment trusts, pension funds, union and fraternal organizations, or any others handling your savings. Why, business in this country is spending nearly $28 billion in new plants and equipment this year, and the greater proportion of this tremendous amount is coming from the savings of small investors, you and I. So it goes without saying that the federal monetary policies must take into account this wonderful and tremendous upheaval in the nation's economy that has made us all, to a greater or lesser degree, investors. And because all of us have savings in one form or another, then of course we're interested in seeing to it that the dollar keeps its purchasing power. Because to the extent that inflation develops, to that extent we lose part of our investment. Now, those who had $1,000 saved up in 1939 and did not draw it, say, till 1953, really took a loss, because inflationary price rises in that time cut the purchasing value of that saved dollar to where there was only $522 in original purchasing power remaining in that $1,000. It was a terrible thing to happen to people who had worked and scrimped to put aside money for education for their children, for the purchase of a home, or to provide for their old age. Perhaps they'd tried, of course, by purchasing insurance or other ways to build up some security to leave to their families. It was a terrible thing to have the purchasing power of the insurance, of the dollar, and the time that it would pay the rent and set the table cut almost in half in just 15 years. It was a heartbreaking thing for a man or woman who had put aside savings in a pension or a retirement trust fund as they worked during their lifetime to find that on retirement that inflation had robbed them of nearly half of what they'd invested to live on in their declining years. Well, to prevent any reoccurrence of inflationary losses, federal monetary policies of the past few years have been formulated with the aim of halting inflation and protecting the investments of our citizens. And to a great measure, these policies have been successful, ladies and gentlemen, because in the last 3 years, the value of the dollar has changed only about 0.5%. This means that inflation has been kept out of your savings almost entirely. Perhaps at this point it would be well to look a little more closely at the major, well, I might call it a major monetary policy of the federal government. First, that budget policy. The Treasury Department believes in and is working toward a balanced federal budget. And in 1953, there was a deficit of probably $9.5 billion. And this has been reduced by reducing federal expenditures so that today there's a real prospect of a balanced budget. I'm sure many of you who heard the budgetary report were very thrilled to realize that a balanced budget is very definitely in sight this year. It has been accomplished primarily by reducing expenditures by some 10 to 12 to $14 billion in there. Yes, progress made in reducing the deficit has been great, and more will be made as each day, each week, and each month rolls by. The battle against excessive government expenditures will continue in full force. But in the battle, I want to remind you that we must not lose sight to overriding considerations. We do have a security problem on our hands that limits our ability to cut. The country must be kept free from aggression. And you know, we might at this point say we endorse wholeheartedly a philosophy of one of our early presidents when he says, there is no dignity quite so impressive and no independence quite so important as living within your budget. Well, we must temper this with a bit of the homespun philosophy of the Adirondacks native who said, what's the good of keeping your figure if you ain't got the strength to move it around? We will have a balanced budget only insofar as it is consistent with national security. More than 70% of federal spending is in military, defense, or atomic programs or in fixed expenditures. And under such circumstances, the reason for not moving faster, of course, is quite obvious. We're eager to make sure that the savings are made with extreme care so that our defense and our security is fully protected. Now, in regard to the management of the public debt, the Secretary of the Treasury has taken steps to make the debt less inflationary, of course, and less dangerous to the value of money and to the nation's economy. And we are also encouraging the widest possible ownership of savings bonds. And I want to take this opportunity to thank each and every one of you for your participation in that program, for the purchase of bonds you have made. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is my commercial to urge your continued support of that program because it does express your confidence in this great nation of ours. Now, our long-term policy is fixed, but our progress toward it is realistically recognizes and adjusts to the problems of today. We wish to encourage savings, which are so necessary to business expansion, and we're aware of the necessity of meeting the essential needs of the economy. And to that end, the Treasury is working cooperatively with the Federal Reserve banks of this country. Then next, I would like to mention the monetary policies that are in our government, peculiarly the responsibility of the Federal Reserve System. This impartial body has worked unceasingly to maintain an effective central banking system as the core of a sound financial mechanism. Primary responsibility, as you well know, for United States credit and monetary policies rests with the Federal Reserve System. Under present federal monetary policies, the system has been free to pursue a flexible policy designed to promote stability and economic growth. And moreover, the Treasury has planned its financing operations so as to complement and not to nullify action by the Federal Reserve System, to keep the supply of money and credit in line with the needs of the country. The effectiveness of this combined effort has, I truly believe, contributed positively to our economic strength and stability of today, so that any discussion of federal monetary policies would be incomplete without the mention of the public debt and the federal debt management policies. Now, our debt management policies, as I said earlier, we have tried to work toward the reduction of this debt and still be cognizant of the needs of our nation. This has involved working toward a better balanced maturity structure of the debt, which now approximates $280 billion, and encouraging a wider distribution of the debt among private investors. We're trying to lengthen its maturity by selling long-term and medium-term bonds. The amount of the floating or short-term debt has been reduced. The savings bond program has been accelerated, and so the monetary policies of our federal government that our government has been following are protecting the savings of every citizen. And perhaps equally important is the fact that these policies are encouraging more and more additional savings. Savings banks deposits are reported high from bank after bank all over the country. Fair rates of interest and fair earnings on money saved and sound money are essential for saving. Because no one's going to save money that earns little or nothing or that he thinks will grow less valuable. And so our savings must be encouraged. It's important to this nation because it strongly reflects additional investment and hopes for even better pay through increased productivity and by preventing the threat of loss through inflation. Federal monetary policies, I'm well aware, cannot in and of themselves guarantee prosperity. This is especially true in America, where government regulation is rightly regarded as the very antithesis of the spirit of free enterprise. The role which the government can play in the economic affairs of this nation is and should be limited. The future of America lies in the initiative, the daring, and the resourcefulness of 166 million Americans, each free to choose how best he can promote his and the nation's interest. It is the cumulative power of this great effort which has made this nation great in the past and which must be relied upon to guarantee future prosperity. My belief and my hope for continued prosperity is based not on artificial government stimulants or war scares, but on the steady spending by consumers and investments by business. This will give the prosperity for a solid base. Our nation has shown that free men in a free world can provide in abundance, can provide plenty in peace, far above the capacity of government-run economies of the world. The best that monetary policies can do to strengthen our nation's economy is to provide an unfettered field in which the American can work without excessive government interference. And from personal observation as Treasurer of the United States and as a member of this administration, I'd like to assure you that federal monetary policies, insofar as possible, are being managed to serve as a tremendous force for prosperity. If all Americans, workers, consumers, producers, investors, go ahead with confidence tempered with prudence, there's every reason to believe solid prosperity of an enduring nature will become a permanent fixture on the American scene. Because, ladies and gentlemen, it is not the gold and silver stored in the vaults that make this nation strong. It's not any one group, any one person, or any one job. It's people pooling their knowledges, their skills, and their know-how into one cooperative effort for our mutual benefit that makes us strong and makes our money the most sought-after money in the world today. And in conclusion, I'd like to repeat for you a few thoughts that I have on the intangible values. I've talked at length about the monetary policies and the tangible values and how important they are. But let us never lose sight of the fact that the most important values are the intangible values. the values that have made this nation great. And for your consideration today, I'm going to repeat a few thoughts that I repeat quite often to groups. Many of you may have heard me repeat them before, and undoubtedly some of you will hear me repeat them again. But I think they're thoughts that will well bear repeating because they're basic. They're thoughts that each and every one of us know in our hearts and minds, but too often, in the stress of a busy existence, we take too much for granted. So I think we can repeat these thoughts because, ladies and gentlemen, these basic intangible values that have made us great are all summed up in the spelling of that very important word in our language, that little word free, for which men have given their lives and would continue to give their lives if ever our freedoms are threatened. And in the spelling of that word, if you please, you have all the basic concepts and the intangible values that have made us great. I want to break it down for your consideration today, beginning with the first letter F for faith. In ourselves, in our fellow men, in our country, and in our God. Faith upon which this nation was founded and through which it grew great, and upon which it will continue to grow great as long as we exercise it. Now we know the story of the founding days of this great republic, how that handful of patriotic men were meeting day after day trying to bring about a government for this new country. And we remember that day after day those meetings were breaking up in chaos and confusion. Why? Because even then there was petty jealousies, there was selfishness, there was misunderstandings, there was intolerance, suspicions, and doubts and fears. And day after day they were getting nowhere. And finally the day came when Benjamin Franklin rose to his feet and he said something to the effect that if not even a sparrow could fall to earth without the notice of the Divine One, how then, said he, can we hope to produce a work of such magnitude? And he proposed that they open their deliberations with prayer. Just the proposal, ladies and gentlemen, gave them food for thought. They began to work together a little better. They began to have a little more understanding for the problems of each other, a little more tolerance for the views of each other, a little more cooperative spirit, a little less selfishness and suspicion. And finally the day came when their work was completed, and as they threw open the doors to the hall, the people were lined in the street shouting, "What have you given us? What have you given us?" And Benjamin Franklin, coming triumphantly forward, said, "We have given you a republic, if you can keep it." They had the faith that they could keep it and the faith that they would keep it. And that brings us to the second letter, R, for responsibility, which goes hand in hand with freedom. We're free only insofar as we do not encroach upon the rights and the freedoms of others, and for every freedom we enjoy, it carries its responsibilities. Oh, you teachers know the meaning of the word responsibility because you're responsible for the future citizens, leaders of this country. You're responsible for laying a foundation of understanding, tolerance. Oh, your responsibilities are great. And I pay tribute to the teachers of this country and the way they assume those responsibilities and the job they're doing with our future citizens of this country. Responsibility with education, or with responsibility coupled with faith, to guarantee that we remain free. And that brings us to the first E, for education, which is the cornerstone of the brotherhood of man. If there's ever to be one, it will come about only through education. Understanding of the aims and aspirations of peoples like ourselves all over the world, their joys, their hopes, their sorrows, and their dreams. Yes, our country set a great store by education. Our histories are replete with instance after instance of the pioneers as they pushed the frontiers ever westward. They did what? They first built homes, and then built schools, and then built churches, or they built homes, and then built churches, and then built schools. Always those three of extreme importance, hand in hand. Education with responsibility and faith to guarantee that we remain free, and that brings us to the last E, for experience, for which there is no substitute. the experience of those great patriots who have gone before us, their mistakes and their accomplishments, the experience which we will pass on to those who follow us, our mistakes, yes, and our accomplishments. And may our accomplishments be as glorious as those that were given to us. Experience which teaches us that we're a great nation of individuals multiplied one by one in each of the 48 states to make a mighty whole, and that we're only as strong as the smallest unit of family life, of community life, of school life, of national life. And it behooves us to keep the small unit strong if the overall unit is to be even stronger. Experience that teaches us that with education, responsibility, and faith, we can have a free, a safe, and a peaceful America and a peaceful world. Thank you.